Good morning, everyone. My name is Daryl Bennett. Come back swinging. Before I even pull up the video that I'm going to pull up, I want to first say that this has bothered me. I didn't even know how to share this, how to put this is a publicly available video. We've had to research copyright laws before even pulling this up because I knew explaining it would not do justice to it, no pun intended. Let me add some clarity and context. As you know, I've been adamant about jobs and justice, adamant about the fact that we cannot just talk about justice, whatever that looks like, in a vacuum. I've been adamant about the fact that we have to look at the distribution of wealth in this country and around the world. We have to look at some of the systematic structures that are in place. We have to look at some of the cycles, the school to prison pipeline, for instance, the fact that they are building facilities to incarcerate people based on third grade testing scores. And these are not just mantras that I'm throwing out. I'm going to show you this video. Now, before I put this up, I have to say this. I do not own the rights to the video. I do not know the person that put this video up. I think we can probably show about 2 minutes of it, if that. We're using, this is under the Fair Act law, so to speak, which basically means that we're not purporting to own this material, but this is, there is an exception to copyright laws. And one of the exception is if it's used for educational purposes. So this is clearly not for promotional purposes in any way. I also want to say, because this is a young man that we're about to watch, that I thought long and hard about whether to share this. It is already publicly available. As you see, this video has been viewed many thousands of times, and there's many other videos about this gentleman that we're about to speak on. So this is not something that is secret. The reason why I am sharing this now at this point is because I think it is important that we have a discussion about why are we where we are as a nation. It's easy to point to when things happen negatively and say, oh my gosh, how did that happen? Or what did they do? But when we really begin to talk about the question of why, it bothers me how many times people talk about, the Black unemployment rate being higher than it ever was before. Well, why should that rate be any different than any other rate? The fact that we even distinguish shows that we still have massive inequality in this country that we've got to deal with. So let me pull this up. This Jobs and Justice, for those of you that know some of my story, you know that I am adamant about there being equity and fairness in the penal system. What we're going to watch is a sentencing of a 12-year-old boy, a sentencing in court virtually, because it was in 2020. So now they're sentencing people virtually. They were first giving people 20 years and all that, with quick sentencings in person, but now it's virtually. So it's even more distant. And this young man is actually a musical artist. He's known. I suspect that many of you, if you've not heard of him before, you will Google him or whatever. I do not know this artist. I want to be very clear about this. And I wish this young man well. But the reason I'm showing this video is because this shows more about us as a society and the systems that are in place more than it says about him. I can only, again, tune in with me here. I'm going to pull this up very quickly, and I'm going to show about 2 minutes of it. Actually, let's do 90 seconds. All right, let's see if we can get this up. Okay. Yeah, I want to make that primary. Let's see. I should have had the video ready, right? That would have helped. Okay.
Monitor on 8/14 of this year.
I really hope people can hear this.
Cut it off. You cried a couple times. Not coming back here. And then this last time we let you out. Mr. Spencer, when was the last time we let him out?
Connor, he cut his monitor on 8/14 of this year ran.
Okay, so about 6 weeks ago, cut off his monitor and ran. You know, you promised me you wouldn't. Right? So now there is evidently a new charge that was filed relating back to April. That's the one where you shot the 1-year-old?
Okay, let me pause this right quick. I know I don't have long because of copyright laws. This right here, this gentleman right here that you see in the corner, he is the 12-year-old that is being sentenced right now. He's being sentenced virtually. And all of these people, I don't even know who half of them are. One's a judge, one is a lawyer, and the other ones are just people involved in this gentleman's life.
Mr. Spence?
Yes, Your Honor, it is.
Like a 1-year-old baby?
Yes.
Okay. All right, so he's on probation for arson. He's accused of shooting a baby at 11 years old. And then we bring him back in. He's been on the run, and he's smoking weed.
Yes, Your Honor.
Okay. Anything else I'm missing about him?
Nope, that's about it, Your Honor.
All right, Mr. Moore. Hey, look what I found. Right? I know 11-year-olds are supposed to have guns. Right? After they've been accused of shooting a baby. Right?
Yes, sir.
So, Mr. Moore, what should I do at this point? Where am I?
Okay, that's really all I could show there. That video bothered me immensely for a number of reasons that I'm not going to be on here for 3 hours talking about. The first thing is, how did this happen? I want to be very clear here because I don't want to be, my mom is always talking to me about balance. This is not one story on one end or the next. This is not just a story about making better choices. It's also a story about society failing people, but it is also a question about personal choices and what's going on in the home. So it's a lot of things happening. This is less about blame and this is more about accountability. It bothers me how often and how quick people are, because he's 12. He's going to grow up. He's going to grow up. Hopefully he grows up. And it's so easy in negative moments in people's lives and people to see that on display and for other folks to kind of swoop in and say, oh, how did that happen? But I think we have to ask ourselves, if he was 18, if he was 20, hey, look, it's a bad person, right? Because that's what we do. We just say that's bad people. But this is a 12-year-old. Well, as you saw from the video, he's been involved in the system at least since he was 9 that we know of. And I'm talking the system, the penal system. We're not talking about all the other systems. You saw the video of that gentleman sitting there at 12 being sentenced. Well, you didn't see the full sentencing. How do we get there? Jobs and justice. It bothers me that, and this is, let me gather my thoughts. People are quick to look at where we are now and forget that there's a history. And when I talk about a history, I'm not talking 300 years ago. I'm not talking 1600s. You want to know something? I'm not even talking 1800s. For the purposes of my conversation here, we're not even going to bring it back to 50, 60 years ago. Let's talk about generationally. Think about things and decisions you've made in your life that 10 years ago that are still affecting you now. But we see the same generationally and societally, what is happening in inner cities across America. I don't want to hear people talk about black on black crime. Let's talk about it. Why is there a concentration of black and brown people in certain parts of the city? Why is it there? See, you can look and say, oh, well, people are shooting each other. Why are they all living in one area? In many cases, in many parts of the city. Do you think that was by choice? Or do you think it was by matter of policy? Can we talk about housing structures? I'm not going to do it today, but I'm going to pull up some facts for you. I want you to see how the housing policies, let's just talk about Chicago. I want to just talk about Chicago because people have made big jokes about Chirac and all of the things that are going on now in 2020. Well, let's reverse the tape. Let's talk about in the 1950s and 1970s where there was a housing boom across America. This is facts. Chicago was the city in the country that got the most money federally to build these, what they call these project buildings. That was a new concept in the 1950s and 60s. They were building them all across America. And cities were getting money from the federal government in order to do it. At the height of this was under Richard Nixon's administration, because it was a big push then to what they call change the landscape in the cities of America. Chicago, under Mayor Daley, got the most money of any city to build projects. This is what they did. They built in the south side of Chicago 28 buildings, massive buildings that were it spanned 4 city blocks, right? And they put people from all over the city and suburbs, black and brown people and people who really didn't have money. And this is what they did. They said, hey, we'll give you vouchers. And if you want assistance, you have to move into these projects. Mind you, they're all in one area of the city. Because I want you to understand, how did we get here now? Let's talk about how we got here now. And then they also said this is a fact. It was policy in Chicago, as in many cities, where they were offering this financial assistance to people who were needing the financial assistance, who also happened mostly to be Black and Hispanic people. The policy was that two parents could not live in the household. That was the policy. The policy was, in order to make so let me back up a little bit. Once the cities across America recognized that they could push housing policy just by, first of all, getting money from the federal government, building these massive structures all across America, and then telling people, if you want our assistance, you have to move in there. So they first recognized that they could do that. In addition to doing that, let's go back to Chicago. They had something called restrictive covenants, where they actually upheld in many places that when people sold their homes, people would sell their homes, right, to other people, but they would put what was called a restrictive covenant in a deed, which would say, a restrictive covenant could say many things, like you can't build, build 2 stories on top of this, for instance, right? But most of the restrictive covenants in the North said you cannot sell these to people who are not white. So I want you to understand policy-wise what was happening. I'm just talking about Chicago, and to give you a microcosm of what was happening across the country. They simultaneously, we've got the cities were pushing people into these places to live, because from a policy perspective, they're thinking, well, let's contain people. Let's put them all in one area. We can watch them easier. It'll just be easier, right? And then at the same token, those, of course, because there were many that could pay their own way, that did not need the assistance of the government, right? And could move and live freely amongst others, right? But they were restricted from doing so because they could not buy the homes, even if they had the money, because the deeds said, now, I believe it was in 1972, Shelley versus Kramer, when the Supreme Court said that was not okay for these states to do. The problem is, by that point, the damage had already been done. I want you to understand something. The damage had already been done. I don't want to pause now and look at where the violence is and say, how do we get here, without having a real discussion. So I'm walking you through from the 1950s and 70s, how there was a massive building projects across the country, and they were building these in the inner cities. And it was economically viable from a policy perspective, because this is what they thought. They said, look, we'll put everybody close to the city because that's where they're working, right? So all of the more well-to-do people move to the outside of the city. That's where you start getting the concept of the suburbs. And they were able to control entire populations simply by containment. That's exactly what was happening. So you never had the question in the 40s and 50s, people talking black on black crime, because it was not the level, ironically, of segregation. It took integration for segregation to happen. I'll explain that to you later. So then, about the time of the 80s and 90s, it was understood across the nation, they made a mistake. This was a bad policy. It just did not work. And so what we found in the 80s and 90s, I was born in 85, there was this way of trying to push things back. This is when you started hearing people talk about the super predators. Because what they said was, we didn't think putting everybody together would compound the problem. Okay, this is when crack appears in cities. I say appear because I want to be fair here. I want to be nice. This is when crack comes out. All of this is happening at the same time. And then across the country, there was a push directed federally again, directed federally to the states. Get rid of all these project buildings. I grew up in Baltimore, and I remember Lexington Terrace Towers. That's where my mom grew up. I did not grow up there. But I remember when they were bringing them down, and all of the emotion behind it. So I want you to see what's happening. You got the 50s, 60s, and 70s across America, cities, they're building these massive project buildings, massive. Chicago was the largest housing project in the country when I talk about the money that they got to build that in the South Side. Then in the 80s and 90s, it was a push to okay, wait a minute, something's wrong. That's when now it's this whole super predator thing. That's when now all of these laws come out. And what we find from the 80s and 90s, the prison population in this country like doubles. It triples by the 2000s, but it doubles in that period. That's when now they say you get, if you had, that 1,000 to 1 law for crack. I mean, all these crazy draconian laws that were happening, right? And then they tore down all these projects. So then where do they take the people? Where do you put the people? Okay. Well, what did they do with the people? They come up with this new idea and say, we're going to create mixed neighborhoods, mixed meaning mixed income. So now you take your voucher and no, we don't want you all to live together where everybody has the one voucher, right? Where everybody is in that one building, right? But we'll put in more mixed communities, mixed meaning mixed income. I can be on here for a whole nother hour on that. The practical effect is this. Around the 2000s, the policymakers in the US woke up and realized something. They said, wait a minute, we made a big mistake. For those of you that's traveled to Europe, you know what I mean when I say this. The wealthy people live in the city, not outside. The palaces are in the city. I mean, some are out, don't get me wrong, but I'm talking about the sign of prestige and wealth was to live in the city. Now remember, I took you on this road, right? In America, we determined as policy, when I say we, that it was better to have the poor people live in the city because they could be closer to work. That was still when public transportation was trying to be figured out. Everybody didn't necessarily have a car. In the 2000s, there became this push, really starting with the 1980s, to reclaim the cities. This is when you start hearing this whole thing about gentrification or regent. See, to be which means it had to be already, but we're not even gonna go there. So now there was this push let's push the poor people back out the city, right? Let's let them have the outskirts, because if anything, they can always travel into the city by commute. That's what we're doing in New York, right? For those people that don't know, right? New York became the model. Can you figure out a way, and pause right quick, let me pause. Do you want to know one of the reasons why they're destroying Rikers Island and it took so long for it to happen? Some of the unlikely allies were not those who are pro-social justice reform, because let's be very clear, the proposal is to remove from one and still put people in 5 other jails. It's not like people being released. There was an unlikely ally. They realized in New York, it's a whole island that if we get rid of that jail, imagine the real estate potential. It's a multi-billion-dollar investment potential. So yeah, go ahead and move it. Because I want you to understand, at the undergirding of many policy decisions is money. At the undergirding of why we find the violence that we find, it's money. It's something that's happening. So let's go back to the 1980s and 90s where we have, and this is why they came down on crack so hard. It had nothing to do with it being more destructive. Let's be very absolutely certain about that, because we know there's a lot of substances that are out here that are super destructive. What happened was, and you can check this, you can fact check me on this. Around the okay, so let me back up for a second. The largest denomination of dollar bills in circulation is, I believe it's like $100 bill. I think you can get a $10,000 bill. I think you have to get like it from the Federal Reserve Bank, something like that. The point I'm trying to make is It used to be you could have $10,000 bills. You could have $100,000 bills, because if you go to Google, they'll tell you there are such thing $100,000 bills. The problem is now only the banks have it, because in the 1970s, at the behest and direction of then President Richard Milhous Nixon, they decided we've got to stop this. Why? What we find is that at the exact time that the monetary policy changes, as far as the amount of money that you could have in denomination, it's not how much you could have, excuse me, when they started changing, saying couldn't have more than $100 bill. The banking law started changing about how much you could have in the bank account without having to report. Then all of a sudden, crack hits the streets. But this is what they found, right? Crack created an entire class of millionaires that they did not want to have the money. So they cracked down, not so much. All of this was happening around the same time, all this monetary policy, because they recognized, wait a minute, we didn't necessarily have a problem with containing them, putting them in ghettos. Because for those of you that know the word ghetto, I know you know that this is something that the Nazis coined. This is not a word that's an American word. It's coined about containment. And the policy was contain them here so we can push them to the camps. It was always an intention to move people from here to there, right? So the thinking was in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, okay, they're contained. And the problem is there's a conflation. It's not just, I want to be clear here, it's not just Black and Hispanic people that are affected by these policies. The problem is it's the poor, the people that are generally, when I talk about poor, when I say poor, I don't mean how much money you have in your bank account. I don't mean if your family has money. People get me with that. Well, yeah, there's millionaires and there's Oprah and I'm talking about systematically poor. That's what I'm talking about. There's power in the ability to just generationally know that you've had access to the system. That's what I'm talking about here. So what happened was it was an entire class. What crack did was it was an entire class of millionaires that was created. Forget the fact they couldn't account for the money. I'm talking about the government. That was already a problem. But they couldn't account for a lot of the money that the mafia had. When I talk about the mafia, the Italian mafia, the Russian mafia, this has been it. Don't believe that lie. The government had always had problems tracking money. The problem with crack was it put money in the wrong hands. If you thought American Gangster, if you watched that when they talked about cocaine, or excuse me, that was heroin, right? And I forget the man's name now, and how he sort of opened up. Like, how are you selling to the mafia? Well, what crack did was exactly that. They were going into these project builds, right? Because their whole thing was, let's build these as matter of policy to contain these people. Now they're finding literally all types of, they would go in and find hundreds of thousands of dollars. So in some cases, because now, okay, let me go back. There's a scripture that says that the enemy will create a snare and fall it to himself. The ironic thing is that for the same reasons that as a matter of policy, people were pushed into the ghettos and the projects, is the same reason that crack in particular created a business opportunity unlike any other. Because now, one, everybody was centralized. Many police officers, the truth of the matter is, many police officers did not police in those neighborhoods. That when they did, it was, it wasn't that active type of policing. So as a matter of policy, again, there was this switch to, as they were now bringing down these towers, right? They're recognizing in the back of their mind, we've got to split up this wealth. See, all of these, I want you to understand at the core of it is still the dollar. I don't want us to get messed up in that, because when we recognize that we're going to begin to make change through redistributing the economic wealth in this country. So what else did crack do? This is it created, with all of this money, what's the one thing that people bought more than anything in many of those communities? Guns. Not jewelry. I know people say, oh, jewelry, cars. All that. No, it was guns, because it was for protection. It was for protection. And I would like to, I don't have time now, I would like to talk about how the Crips started. Community revolution in progress. I understand people have this idea here. I would like to talk about Larry Hoover and what his vision was and why he created, the organization he created. what it was when he came together and they, created what they created, what the Gangster Disciples were. I wish I could have a little bit more time to really, because I think what we do is we take a snapshot now, and because we don't understand the history and we don't appreciate the history, we let other people tell our history. When I say I'm not just talking race here. I'm talking about, don't let somebody who's never been in your community talk about the history of your community. What the heck do they know? Why do they? Because I'm giving you a reason for why these things are happening. So I already took you through the massive project building structures across the country. Then he realized, let's bring them down. Right around this time, the crack is devastating many of these communities. Devastating. I'm talking structurally, even if that parent wasn't affected, right? It wasn't about that. It's about a systematic underpinning that was happening across a spectrum of people. And at the same time, they're coming at the core of people's identities, because now it's, let's bring back down these towers, right? And disperse people again. So you got the same people who historically don't have a name, because you went from being, a nigga to a Negro to Afro-American, back to being a Negro, now, then colored, then black. I don't know where, what the spectrum is today. So so you keep getting moved around, right? Because I want you to understand why people rep their set and rep a neighborhood. Because for them, and this is no judgment, for some people, their tie is as strong to that as yours might be to Italy, right? Because you've been to Italy, right? And you have an identity there. But for some people, their identity is tied in something different. And I want to give clarity and context so we have a richer picture of how we got here as a nation. So then we're at the 2000s. And several things begin to happen. First of all, September 11th. What a lot of people do not recognize is that who the Patriot Act affected most, affected not with an E, neutral effect, with an A, negative effect, were poor, Hispanic, and Black communities. And I'm going to tell you why. Much of the language, though, was directed at terrorism as this transnational global system of disruption. You think terrorism, you think planes, you think Osama bin Laden, you probably think caves. Well, I'll just throw in a quick thing here for those of you that followed any type of celebrity news. When Chris Brown got into that situation with Rihanna, he was charged with a terrorism charge. And even his lawyer, Mark Garrigo, said, everybody knows this type of charge was not created for this conduct. I'm just giving you a piece of how law in its intent, which was meant to ensnare transnational global terrorist units, begin to then be unleashed in a paramilitary style on many of these same communities. That was their way of zero tolerance, tough on crime, super predators. So we saw a vast militarization of our cities. This is why it bothered me after January 6th when everybody was saying, it's so sad as a country that we have to have the National Guard in DC for the inauguration. But some of us have grown up in communities that we've seen militarization. When you have a police SWAT team come in with the same training and the same equipment that they use in Fallujah, Iraq, and some of them have fought there and come here with the same paradigm and mindset, it's a war mindset. And I'm telling you this from having gone to a historically Black college, Morehouse College in Atlanta, Georgia, and seen out confrontations with police, and been at Harvard Law School and seen confrontations with police. And I'm telling you, and you know this, the way, and I grew up for the first 13 years of my life, I was in Baltimore, right? And then I moved to Virginia. I went to high school. We were living in a trailer park in Virginia. So I went from living with poor Black folks, just say it, poor white folks. I mean, first time I got called a nigga, the dude didn't even have his shoes, and he was called, I was like, what? Huh? But whatever. I'm saying all that to say there is a vast difference, a vast, huge difference in the way that law enforcement approach communities. And it bothers me that folks who are outside of the community that have no understanding are so quick to give an opinion on it. Privilege at the core of it. I don't want to talk about white privilege or male privilege because there's a such thing as male privilege and white privilege. But privilege is all types of things. You have privilege. I have privilege because I was born in America because I learned English first. If I was born in Tibet on the side of a mountain and learned, I don't know, whatever that language is over there, I don't know if I'd have as much effect, right? So there's privilege, right? But privilege is when you can have an opinion about something that you're not affected by. How can you, who have never stepped foot in many of these communities, have anything to say about black on black crime or what's happening there, or they just don't like the police? What the heck do you know? What do you know? What do you know? How do you know it? That's what I should ask. What is your reference point? Is it something you saw on the television? Because my reference point, I'm gonna roll it back to Harvard. My reference point for what the Ivy League was completely different till I got in. That's why even when I talk to people and they have these ideas of like, well, what do you know? My reference point for China, when people talk, China's so advanced, I've been to China. I've been there. I've sat with the leaders in Beijing. So no, I don't walk away with thinking after we left China, I did not walk away thinking that they were gonna take over in the next 10 years, right? I just didn't think so because I saw the everyday person, the population, the vast, this is a side point, while their technology is great and all that, the vast majority of their people are living in abject poverty. And a country like that cannot be blessed. That's why my heart hurts as I see America, the gap widening between the rich and the poor, because that's really the fight. They want us focused on one other thing, but that's not really it. It's really about the power structures versus those who are not in the power structure. So what we found is in the 2000s, with the passage of the Patriot Act and this zeal to lock up super predators, lock up all these people who are doing wrong, the 3 strikes rule. I want to be very clear how the 3 strikes rule works. In certain states like California, the 3 strikes rule meant that a 3rd strike of anything, even a misdemeanor, meant that a person can get a life imprisonment. Now, let me roll this back because I showed you the video in the beginning of the 12-year-old. We were watching that. Y'all might have just joined me. It was a 12-year-old who was being sentenced. That's the video we watched together. He was being sentenced by a judge. He's 12. The judge already said that was his 2nd appearance, at least in his court. So I want you to understand the practical effect of something like a 3 strikes rule. So now let's go back to you live in one of those communities. Police contact is inevitable. It's inevitable. It's not about if, it's just about when, and it's just about how does that work out, right? So now this kid is 12 with 2 strikes. I just want you to understand how the law works. So that means if he was in California under that law, he does anything else wrong, he goes to prison for life. So that was another thing that was happening, right? So all of these things happened to the effect of between 1980 and about 2005, the prison population in America tripled. Who do you think that affected most? Because there's no secret here. Who do you think it affected most? What communities? I'll tell you, the same communities that were being shuffled around, the same communities I told you about in the 50s, 60s, and 70s that they built those projects, the same communities that they look back and say, wait a minute, it's super predators in there because they're all living together and it's all this. The same communities that there was a fight to say, you know what, keep them in their schools because they're bringing that violence into these schools over here. The same communities that they put they're building jails based off of those testing scores, and they're building metal detectors in those schools. There's never been a massive school shooting, by the way, in any of those inner city schools. I just want to say that now. And you never heard a school shooting and people call it a white on white crime, but because I just want to point out the blatant discrepancy and dastardly hypocrisy of it all. But those same communities, ironically, those were the ones that the prison mass incarceration phenomenon in this country, as it exploded, those are the ones that were affected most, right? You've heard the statistics. You know that 1 in every 4 people who are in prison in the world, think about that, are in prison in America. We have 25% of people who are in cages, because that's what it is, it's cages. 25% of the people in cages in the world are in cages in America. Maybe they're in state cages, federal cages, local cages, but they're in cages. But That's here, right? And and again, that rate exploded. Now we have more Black people who cannot vote as a result of their rights being taken because of involvement in the penal system than there were who could not vote because they were slaves 100 years ago. Because I want you to understand the practical effect. Because then what happens is, oh, you got arrested 20 years ago. Oh, no, but you shouldn't be voting. No, you shouldn't be voting. And then you wonder when you get to 20 years later when they say these people in these communities always complain and they don't vote. Can we talk about Reconstruction when voting was the highest in Black communities? And that's when the KKK was formed. And you talk about people being that I can't even tell you that I forget the woman's name that they hung her by her feet. She was pregnant and cut her stomach and baby came out. All this stuff based off of voting because there's power in voting. And there was an understanding about that. There wasn't a concern about people living in their own communities, dancing, singing. You could do all that. We don't even mind if every now and again you want to start your own business. But with the voting came state money. I already explained to you. All of those housing policies, the problem of why it hurt our communities the most is because it's people that are not in our communities making the decisions. That's why I'm passionate about where I am now. That's why it bothers me when I hear people and I'm sitting sometimes at the table and I want to be like, you have no clue what you're saying. That's like me. Let me be very clear here. That's like me having an opinion. I remember the other day, somebody was talking about, it was a young lady. She was from Thailand. She was just talking about the struggles, being here in the Thailand community and some of the things happening in just the Southeast Asian community in America. She asked me about my opinion. I don't have an opinion on that. How can I have an opinion on that? I don't even know. I've lived 2 days in that shoe. I think we've got to stop thinking we always have to have an opinion about everything. And I'm not one that believes that you should respect everybody's opinion. I will respect you. I'm not going to necessarily respect your opinion because opinions are what drive policy, which has driven the phenomenon of where we are now. And so this is why I'm so passionate about informing in context and clarity, because when you have people sitting around a table and they're making a decision, they need to have a full, rich scope of what's happening in that community. I don't want just people who only came in that community because they had to police that community to make the decision, or only because they had to come and get for a vote, or only because, I knew somebody there. And I'm not just talking about being in the community geographically. I'm talking relationally. That's really what I'm talking about. I left Baltimore geographically a long time ago, but I never left the movement. I never left the community. That's why I became an attorney. That's what drove me after this. I can't just take this degree and walk around and make a lot of money and leave my people. The people, when I say my people, I'm not just talking racially, ethnically. I'm talking about the people of America, the people who are hardworking people. I get tired when I hear people angry. People lambast and say people don't work hard enough. I know people who work in 2 and 3 jobs, regardless of color. They need an opportunity. They need a chance. I'm tired of ministers from the pulpit or judges making these self-righteous statements, telling people to stop the violence and these campaigns and just say no. You want to know what you want to say? Say yes to opportunity. Let's empower people. Let's give people a reason to want to get up and be productive members of society. Let's let people. This is what we found. We found in a lot of these communities that up to the age of about 10 or 11, kids were kids. That's what they found. Kids were kids. They would raise their hand. They knew the answer to something. They were excited, bright-eyed, bushy-tailed. And right around 12 is what we see things break. Ironically, that's around the time that they're looking at testing scores to determine 10 years later how many cages they're going to need. Because what they determine is there's a place and the time of a child's life in many of those communities where they recognize that the America that they heard about is not the America that they live in. It's not the same America. And the choices that are made, I don't want to paint people out and say people are angels. People make poor choices in certain cases, but the choices are then made from a different framework. When you have not had to work to support your family as a kid, you have a different perspective. When you don't know anybody that's been incarcerated. This is it, or let's take it the other way. When that's been your parent, that's been every household that you know, every household that somebody's been taken away. Somebody told me, I was talking to somebody the other day, he said, the problem is we have no old wise men in our communities. I said, that's not true. They're there. They're just in cages. The problem is many of them made poor choices, and by the time they learn and they've been corrected, they've seeped in the system for so long, 20, 30 years, that by the time they could have had an influence on the next generation to tell them there's a better way. You don't have to do it that way. I did it that way. There's hope, there's more, there's peace, there's greatness. By the time that they're there to do that, now their kids are on their way in and they're coming out. And that's done purposefully. I don't want you to think that this is done by accident. The scripture says, smite the shepherd, you'll scatter the sheep. It's a reason. I told you housing policy in many cities was, and I've never finished that thought. I got so carried away. What they said was, in order for them, for certain like population, right, if you wanted to meet the voucher or meet whatever the requirement was, you had to be a single parent household. They said that. They baked that into the rule, the policy. That wasn't an accident. So what happened? There were parents and there are fathers that will tell you in the 70s and 80s, they willingly left the home because they understood it was better for their children and their wife for them to live somewhere separate so that way they could get the voucher to live. I'm talking the parent and the children. Now, I'm not trying to out here say that there are not people out here having all these kids and running all around, but I want to give understanding to why that's happening. Because there was a policy in place in many of these communities that said they cannot be there. I can already tell you in many of these communities, and they already are building prisons based on it, and then people go, then they say when you come out, you can't be associated with a felon. What does that mean? Anybody that's been convicted of a felony. Well, what does that mean? I already told you. That means 1 in every 4 people who is Black or Hispanic has had some level of involvement, arrest, incarceration, conviction. So that doesn't necessarily mean felony, but when you start talking about the sheer number of people, so they're released. In some cases, they can't live with their father. Why? Because they were convicted. Maybe the father's totally turned his life around. In many cases, he has. That's not the point. So then they're told, I've told you, I've seen this firsthand. I've lived it. They will tell you, no, you can't talk to your parent. Do they have a record or you have a record? And if we find that out, we're going to put you back in a cage. And so I want you to understand why there are parents that come out of the system and don't reach out to their children. Because so let's take the one that went in at 20, had a kid, comes out at 30. The kid's now 11, old enough to have a relationship. Now I already showed you a sentencing with an 11-year-old that's had running with the law. I want you to understand that a parent that had a felony to talk to that kid, that would actually be in violation, perhaps, of their release conditions. And they could be sent back to prison for trying to mentor that kid. I want you to understand how screwed up and wrapped and warped it is. So if we're going to make a change and talk about correction, let's talk about correction. If we're really going to make a difference, and I hope that there are people who are watching me that are prosecutors and judges. Hey, law enforcement, I think many of you get into this because you want to do good. But let's talk about the system. Now that we recognize, I know I've been on here for way too long. Now that we recognize where we are, which is, I think we hit the incarceration bubble. I think we'll all look back and realize, I think we're at the peak of it. I think we're actually past the peak. The peak was about 3 or 4 years ago. I mean, it was crazy at one point where it was literally just like a system that they were just like feeding, and it was like millions of people. And I think really the reason why that bubble is burst is because the practical effect has already been done, which is that you've already kind of decapitated an entire generation of older wise men, right? Because perhaps they're already still behind bars. I won't even tell you how infuriated I am that they are making weed a legal business when I have people that I know that are sitting behind bars for selling it. Right. So it's like, but you might say, well, they did other stuff, but they're sitting behind for that charge. So how can now we say as a people, what did Maya Angelou say? When you know better, you do better. I get it. We know better. We say, okay, marijuana, not weed, excuse me. We're going to now make it a legal business. Shouldn't, as common sense, as a matter of policy, as fairness, that we also say that simultaneously that we cannot say it's okay for you to sell it, but then I'm still going to keep you in prison? I know we can't give them the time back, but you're going to still keep them in there for that? That's the hypocrisy of it, right? And so the practical effect is you've got the over-incarceration bubble, right? That has happened. You've got the over-militarization of our communities. The paramilitarization of the American police force was one of the most destructive things I think have been done to the culture of this country. And to be fair, I don't think it was. I think what it is when you give people technology without training, when you give them that type of power without teaching and protocol, you're going to have these types of things happen. I mean, the fact that they would do these raids and they would go, I mean, Breonna Taylor is an example of it. How can you just go into someone's home and shoot them dead, even if you have a warrant, right? I mean, to me, I don't understand. Not when you have the Dillingers, or whatever his name is, Dylan or whatever, that shoots up a church and is on a run, kills 9 people, and they take him in handcuffs. So we know that you're able to apprehend people, right, peacefully. So why did you kill this lady in her sleep? Right. But that's because in many cities, the police have been empowered to act as a military force. And that's corrosive. It's when you see a lot of the technology and the things that they're using, I'm telling you, it's the stuff that is being used on the front lines. And that is because it's a war footing. I want you to understand that. In the last 4 years, the American government, and I think we have to be very clear about this, it was not just the American president. It was the American government at the behest, direction, and orchestration of an entire leadership team that as a policy, I want you to understand what was happening. As a policy, put the government on a war footing against Black and Hispanic people. It's no question about it. It was a war footing. That's why there was a beefing up of all of these different types of laws. I can tell you this, I saw this with my own eyes happen. The minute that Donald Trump was elected, because you know how it works, when the president is elected, inaugurated, what is it, like 12:01, I think, or 12 o'clock, everything switches. I remember, for those of you that read my book, you know where I was at the time. I was indisposed. I was away on a government vacation. And I remember even the officers, I mean, these people don't have any reason to give you a heads up. Even the officers after the election were giving us clues as to things that were going to shift the moment that Donald Trump became president. So I don't want to play as this is about politics. There's power in those positions because I've seen it. I was having a discussion with somebody. I remember I was going back and forth with them on the internet. This is a person great guy, I'm sure, but I still tell you, he has no clue on this. I was telling him that the president has the ability to pick up the phone and direct his attorney general to have anybody he wants for federal prison release. And he said, no, they have to go through a process. Are you serious? I've seen it. I watched it. You saw it with again, this is not a political point to him. I get it. If I'm president and my people got in trouble, I probably would try to make some calls too. But you saw that people keep talking about 2 systems of justice. It's a lot. It's about 20 systems of justice. And it's not just about race. It's about power. It's about influence. It's about who you know. When you know people, you get treated different. They know who they were. So anyway, I'm saying all this to say I watched from the inside how things changed. I watched how there were people whose petitions were in court because they had spent decades in prison. They're kind of waiting. They had other petitions in, and they knew the clock was running. They knew January 20, whatever that date was, 2017, they knew that there was no leniency coming. And it was sad to know that, when you have power like that, you can have grace. That's the power of power. I watched from the inside because I saw also President Obama, how I remember the guy, I still can't get over. He called his mother. He had 15 years left on his sentence. He called his mother and said, I'm coming. I need you to pick me up. Because he received not a pardon, but a commutation. There is a difference. But a commutation, which means you can go home immediately. So I saw, and this was happening left and right. And these were people in some cases, like the one guy, he had spent 20 years, and he wanted to make a change, make a contribution to society. So it wasn't like people were being released or people were running around with, anyway, I don't want to get aside with that. But I want to point out, it hurt me these past 4 years because for those of you that maybe listen to me and you might think, what's about politics? You really need to look at my trajectory. You need to look at the fact that I went to Bush's inauguration. I was the one talking about I was a Democrat for a while and I was a Republican. I didn't know what I was. I've always been Team America. But the last 4 years, this was not about politics for me. I saw how power could be used so corrosively. That hurt me. To know, just like you could release people, you could literally, and we saw this happen. Oh no, shut down all their petitions. Let them know. Make them know you're going to suffer. Wow. And then 2 years later, from those same prisons, to watch him spring his friends free. Oh, I was pissed off. I'm going to be honest. I probably shouldn't even say that on here. Oh, but I'm going to tell you, I was. And I had to really work through my anger about that. Not for me personally, but for all the people. And I watched on CNN people talk about, oh, it's COVID, so that's why people had to get out. But what about all the other ones in there? Is COVID not affecting everybody? So, again, context and clarity. When we have a better understanding of what's going on, maybe then it'll change the opinion more. I find the more I learn, the less I have an opinion on something, actually. Because I recognize the more I know, the more I realize, like, wow. I can tell you for a fact, I knew much more about law as an attorney before I had my lived experience. I knew much more about the law from an armchair studying it than when I saw it face to face. Much more. If you get what I mean. I knew more, but I understand better now. Because see, there's a difference between knowledge and wisdom. See, you can learn knowledge in school. Knowledge will tell you that my pastor said this the other day. Knowledge will tell you that tomatoes are fruit, but wisdom will say you don't put it in a fruit salad. Yeah. And so what wisdom showed me is that, oh, they might pass a law like the Patriot Act while everybody's looking because everybody's focused on terrorism and stop bin Laden. But then 4, 5, 6 years later, the practical effect is they're going into neighborhoods and they're calling 5-man gangs terrorist organizations. And they're knocking their heads off with 100 years. Because once they've been given this terrorist designation, nobody even wants to deal with them. In some cases, they'll put them in special units and designate them as terrorists. Really? I remember one of the guys, he was literally in the same, the one that was the shoe bomber, because he's in federal custody. He was housed in one of the same places because of the designation. Really? But that's what happens. I want you to understand the practical effect. The practical effect of policy that's driven, where now with social media, they will use RICO laws. I'm going to do a whole thing on this. So for those of you that follow Come Back Swinging, our next show, which is going to be Thursday, it's the third Saturday of every month. I'm gonna have somebody on. We're gonna be hashing this whole thing out about how. So I want to ring the alarm on this. How social media is being used now to ensnare more people in those communities than any other tool. It's the number one tool. And the crazy thing is, you're helping them. You're helping them. When Daniel Hernandez, also known as, what is his name? Tekashi 6ix9ine. When they apprehended him and they got into his phone, I'm sure they accessed it through the cloud anyway, but now they could legally say that they were doing it. They saw all of the conversations that were being had, not just amongst him, but amongst other people and all that. People now, because let me tell you something, how the RICO laws work. The RICO laws were again, it was a federal construction to bring down the mafia. Because I want you to understand the difference between the theory of the law and what happened. So the theory was, we're using this for the big boys. This was Giuliani's tool. This is how he cut his teeth as a U.S. attorney for the Southern District of New York back in the 80s. He was taking down the big mob bosses, the people who were controlling the construction sites here in New York and controlling the building. You might think of mafia as just the Goodfellas and movies you watch. They were controlling billion-dollar industries, and they were, that was the whole point of the 5 families in the council. And so the point of RICO was, we want to break down this system, really, which was at variance and at contradiction with the federal system, and had all of this power. Okay, fast forward now, they're using RICO laws and using it against people who nickel and diming selling drugs out of their mother's kitchen because they put on social media that they are connected with 2 or 3 other people. Because under RICO law, all they have to do is establish that you are an organization that has been designated as this racketeering organization. Well, what means that you're an organization? One day I'll sit there and I'll give you a whole legal explanation of it. But an organization, at the gist of it, could just mean, unifying colors, flags, anything like that. Anything that you see people doing on social media. You threw up a hand sign and 3 of y'all did it. Oh, that's a sign. Y'all organization. Once they are able to designate an organization as this racketeering organization, then they come in, swoop in with the laws, with RICO, and they no longer have to prove that each person did whatever the thing was. So let me go back to, let me use my mouse. Let me say the mouse right here, right? Let's say the mouse, because I'm going to explain RICO to you, is the organization, right? So it used to be if person A, B, C, or D did something, you had to charge them with murder. You had to charge them with shooting somebody. You had to charge them with whatever. Okay, RICO changed all that. What RICO said is, and this was a construction of Rudy Giuliani's mind, and the Supreme Court upheld it later. And basically what they said was, this is what we'll do. All we have to do is RICO, Racketeering Influence Corrupt Organizations Act, right? It was passed, I forget exactly when, but late 1970s. And the aim, of course, was to take down the mafia. They said, look, all we have to do is establish this thing as an organization, right? That's all we have to do. Let's just start there. Establish the thing as an organization, right? Once we establish that, we don't have to tie the murders, the robberies, the drug dealings to people. We tie it to the organization, right? Everything gets tied to this organization that's been held. Now, all they have to do is prove that you somehow touch that organization and you're a part of RICO. Now you might get 20, 30 years, it depends. That's all they have to do. So it took it from what it used to be, 3 or 4 people doing something. No, I wasn't there. I don't know. Oh, yeah, I might know him. That's my buddy, but I was not there. That was a viable defense. What RICO did was totally changed it. And the reason why, they knew they could never get the mob bosses. This was meant not just to bring down the mob, it was meant to bring down the bosses. The bosses were never doing wrong, as far as they could tell. They could never catch the bosses doing anything. So what they decided was, as a legal team, Southern District of New York, most things that happen legally in this country are tested in this district first. They said to themselves, let's try to figure something out. Even Rudy Giuliani, when he came up with the idea, they said that people in his team, that the courts are not going to uphold this because this is kind of not right. But I want you to understand something. Courts will always uphold when it's in their best interest, because the practical matter is it made sense, even if it wasn't legally sound. So what they did was said, we don't no longer have to try to get the Gambinos of the world and all that. We don't have to have them with their finger on the button, because that's never going to happen. They've got capos, they've got lieutenants, they've got people that are far removed. So what we do is we establish it as a corrupt organization. We establish the Gambino family. That's what they did as a corrupt organization. Oh, that murder, it's tied to the organization. Oh, that's tied to organization. The robbery 20 years ago that we now just got, it's tied to organization. So RICO tied all that stuff to the organization, the Gambino family, all these other families, they're all being tied. And then this is what Rudy Giuliani said. Now this is how we bring down the bosses. We just prove they're connected to the organization. That's all. We don't have to say they called this person a murder. You see how it works now? It's a 3-point connector, right? Or the connector is the organization and that's why they were able to really decapitate the organizations. They got the leaders of the 5 families, took them down literally overnight. That would have never happened without RICO laws. Now, fast forward to 20 years later, overzealous prosecutors in courts who just uphold it said, you know what, the same way we did with them, we're going to do this in those communities, except they're not working with billions of dollars. See, when they were going up against the mafia, you have to understand, in many cases, the mafia had as much money as the jurisdiction they were fighting against. So it was a different type situation. Now what they do is they're going in and saying, oh, an organization doesn't have to be 40,000 people. It doesn't have to be 100 people. They don't have to be in suits having meetings and all that. Organization can be 3 people. They have a color that they like to wear. They have a sign that they like to throw up. We know it because we look at their social media. It's not like they had to dig for it. You told them. You told them. You told them. You told them the sign. You told them, you know, you probably had a flag on you. You told them all that. And so they're checking off all these things because what they're doing is, you know, if you've ever heard of the hip hop police, they use the social media, law enforcement, and they're trolling on social media, right? They're friending people. You want clout? People get me. I want views. Every view ain't a good view. All closed eyes ain't sleep. So they're watching, they're listening, they're friending, they're DMing too. They're sliding in the DMs, and this is what they're doing. They are establishing the organization. Because it used to be, and I want you to understand this too, it used to be Bloods and Crips, you know, and then Latin Kings maybe and something else. Now that's completely changed. For those of you that have followed any of this stuff where you got the Woos, the Chews, the GDs, the BDs, all of this stuff, all of this stuff that's happening, you have all of these what's called sets, meaning that you have two people have the same color fighting each other. The reason why this is important to know is that this plays right into the hand of law enforcement. This plays right into the hand of law enforcement because it used to be that they had to establish that this was like a real organization. Because what is an organization? You knew because it took them years to get the mafia. But when you start doing it in the organization, they didn't start with the three people. It never gets there. It started with, well, they're going to take down an indictment on a whole block because a whole block might be the whole project. In some cases, they were finding projects were making $1 million a day through drug operations. You think the Fed's going to just let that happen? You think law enforcement going to watch that happen? Even if they do have their hand in it, they want to double dip. Let's make money off of it, and let's put people away and control this thing if we can. And so what transpired as a result is you've got all of these people, right? You've got all of these folks out here, and you got all these different organizations, so to speak, and law enforcement is just cataloging. And the difference is, I want to roll this back. Remember back to when I explained, when they had to tie the thing to the person. So let's say they were investigating the person. Well, if the person died, I mean, the case might not close, but, you know, if we're looking for you as a suspect and you die, well, you know, it takes some of the air out of it. Well, when we are investigating an organization, right? Because people are dying too quickly. Unfortunately, people are dying too quickly. And some of these, especially you get these rap battles and all this, every season, there's somebody dropping. So what they're saying is to study these organizations, and they're studying them. What they're doing is they're just saying, you know what? We'll just keep the research on the organization. And then where people make their mistake is you self-identified yourself with the organization. And I know I watch people, I'm going to do an entire session or series on, I know that people try to be slick and they say things like, oh, I'm doing music, we're not in the streets, all that. They're not. Listen, they're watching. You put out the music, all this stuff is on social media. I cannot tell you how many people that I know personally, who are sitting on over 10 years in prison based off of what they post on social media. Alone. Because that's what you call speech that they gave themselves. It's not. They incriminated themselves. People always talk about snitching. It's a self-snitch because you have self-identified. You've self-identified. I'm a part of this organization. You may not have known law enforcement was looking at this organization for 5, 6, 7 years. They've been tying all types of things, murders, rapes, attempted rapes, robberies, all types of things that you may have never even conceived. And the very fact you self-identify. Now, I'm not saying automatically that means you get charged with all those things, but what happens is it now puts you in the ball game. It puts you in the game, right? So now you're getting charged with something. It's just about what? I want to be clear. I'm not saying. So then, of course, it becomes a bargaining chip. The ones that are higher up, of course, they get more because they probably were more involved with said organization. They're going to get more of the charges, right? But then you have and this is the last legal theory that I promise I'm going to tell you today, and then I'm done. The legal theory of felony murder. If the other two that I told you doesn't make you upset, the fact that I told you how they started with saying the Patriot Act was to stop the terrorists, and now they're using all these charges and they're using these same tactics against the communities. The other thing I want to say about it is this felony murder thing, and this thing is crazy. Felony murder is, and this is not in every state. Every state does not have it. Many states that did have it are trying to pull it back because they recognize how bad of a name it's got. It's just a horrible thing. So you know what murder is. Murder in the first degree in many states just means you premeditated and kill somebody. Accused, of course, but that's the charge. To prove it, you have to prove premeditation and killing, even if it's a second degree. You have to prove that the intent and then the act. All right, that's pretty self-explanatory. Felony murder is different. What felony murder says is, if during the commission of a felony, a murder occurs, that person's on the hook for the murder. So let's go back. Let's take someone who is, let's take George. George runs in the store with John. All right. They rob the store. They see another clerk. They shoot the clerk. One guy shoots the clerk. Clerk dies. Prosecutors can say felony murder. Person who shot definitely is going to get that charge. Person in the store is probably going to get the charge because you combine felony murder with the hand of one is the hand of all. Everybody that was involved in that is probably going to get charged with that murder. So you say, well, what do you mean involved, Daryl? Well, certainly the one that was in the car. The ones that drove them there. We already talked about the ones that did the shooting, the ones that drove them there. What about the ones that knew that were at home and they're part of this organization? I want you to see how every legal theory, they don't work in a vacuum. It all works together. So now they're in that organization, right? And so now it becomes, no, you were involved in that. So all of those people potentially can be charged with that one murder. And so the practical effect is the government can put away 10 people for 20 years for a murder for one person. Bring that out to conspiracy, because that holds the same, in many states, the same same length of time. Conspiracy just means you meant to do it. You just didn't get around to doing it. I know plenty of people, same thing, have those types of charges. They have 10, 20 years behind bars. Nobody died, but it was a conspiracy, supposedly, right? Let me take it back further, right? Let me go back to felony murder and show you how far away this got. Even the prosecutor, when they first tried this, they said the first judge that heard this kind of was on the bench like, what? But again, this passes muster. Let me go back. Felony murder. If during the commission of a felony, there is a crime, a murder that happens, the person that committed the crime is on the hook for the murder. I'm giving you the loose legal language. I think the exact legal language is commission of a crime in furtherance of the crime, because there was a whole argument what means in furtherance. All right, I'm gonna come back to that actually, because that's what it is. It's an act in furtherance of the crime. There we go. Then and that leads, if it's a felony and it leads to a death, then they can be charged with felony murder, right? Even if so let's say you didn't mean to murder, you just choke the person, but you meant to choke them. That's the felony that leads to murder, right? So let me bring it further. One person walks in the store with one other person, two people are in the car. They go to rob the store. I'm giving you a scenario. I hate to be so morbid here. They shoot one of the clerks, right? I already explained to you, we don't have to prove that anybody meant to kill that clerk if the clerk dies, right? They can all be charged with felony murder. Why? I already told you it was a murder in furtherance of the crime. But this is what an overzealous, because I'm telling you how the theory, it goes from a theory. My green screen is acting up, y'all. Help me. I gotta go. I want you to know how the theory goes from a great theory to an overzealous prosecutor that takes it to a whole nother level, right? One prosecutor comes up with this idea because there was a case where persons walked in the store. They, same sort of scenario. Some people in the car, some people in the store, one person shoots. The difference is the clerk shot back. Clerk did not die. Clerk wasn't even shot. Clerk shot one of the robbers. Robber died. Prosecutor said, we're charging all of y'all with felony murder. The lawyers for these guys said, how can you do that? Now we understand they're going to get charged with something, maybe shooting at the clerk, maybe robbery. How can you charge them with murder? They said, well, somebody died. But they said, but wait a minute, no. It was one of their own people. Prosecutors said, we don't care. So the whole argument came about, and I think it went even to the appellate court, the language of furtherance. Was that shooting of the clerk, because the lawyers for the I know I'm going fast, y'all. I get excited. The lawyers for the defendants, who were the friends of this guy who got killed, were trying to say, when that clerk shot back, that was not in furtherance of the crime. He was doing that to deter the crime. Well, clearly it wasn't in furtherance of the crime. Which way do you think the courts went on that? I know I can't see y'all comments, y'all, but I'm sure you know which way it came down. The answer was, the courts determined then, as many have upheld today, yes, that was totally fine. So that guy, yep, you bury your friend and you get charged with the murder. And you know what that means? All of them get life, just automatically. So again, what we're talking about is not people should not be charged because the lawyer was saying, charge them for the right thing, charge them for the robbery, charge them for the shooting. Don't charge them when you know clearly. And nobody could say with a straight face that the robber shooting back, that the clerk shooting back was in furtherance of the crime. Nobody could say that with a straight face. Nobody, because that furtherance was really that piece of language that got them. But the court, as courts often do, basically said, we've got to leverage our eloquent legalese with the practical necessity of police to do their work. And prosecutors to do what they need to do. So therefore, if you go in a store, you do that. So I'm giving you examples of how do we get to this place where in certain communities, a person is 80% more likely to be ensnared in the penal system. You cannot talk about that in isolation and then just say, oh, well, it's just because they didn't go to school, or they could have gone to college like everybody else, or they had the same opportunities. Part of what, and I know this took me a long time, I don't even see the time here. I think I've been on here for almost an hour and a half because I'm trying to lay groundwork and context and clarity. So that way we're not so dismissive to just say everybody had the same opportunities. Now, I'm not here to, I'm always about empowering people. There's always a choice you can make. There's no question about that. There's always something you can do because there are people that make it out, right? Okay. But the fact that we've got to talk about making it out is a problem. The fact that we have to talk about Black on Black crime as being separate than crime in general and as being something that somehow should be treated as any different is a problem. The fact that a person is far more likely, just based on where they are born, to be involved in the penal system, which would then affect their ability to go to college. It'll affect their ability to get financial aid. It will affect their ability to get certain jobs. Take the 11-year-old I just showed you. Let's say he turns his whole life around. He has plenty of time to turn his life. Let's say 5 years, he solidly turns his life around. He's 16 now, and he's put all this behind him. He still has that record. He'll always have that record. In some jurisdictions, even though they might, for jobs, say it won't affect you because, let's say, your record's been sealed, you still have to disclose that in many places. If you wanted to be a law enforcement agent, you would have to disclose that. And so when you go back to this thing about the people closest to the solution, closest to the problem, closest to the solution, why do we automatically say if someone has an arrest that they could not be in law enforcement? Why should that just be an automatic? I mean, it's not necessarily, it depends on the jurisdiction, but I think we need to relook at that, at least case by case. Here's a guy, he's 11. Who better to tell people to turn their lives around, especially if he turns his life around? But what happens is people, we first, it's the old saying, we give people alcohol, then you lock them up from being drunk. What happens is we create these systems and then we act shocked when they work the way that they work. You created a policy of housing and where you put everybody together, where you lock them out of it. It was meant to do that, where you say, look, this is where the poorest schools will be. We're not putting funding for schools. All of the funding went to, in those neighborhoods, in the places that I'm talking about. It went to, these massive systems to, and how, confine people, all that. That was all done intentionally. And so then you wonder why in those same neighborhoods, there's a correlation we're finding now that there's higher rates of violence, why there are higher rates of parents not being in the home. I told you already, this is the third time I'm telling you, there is a housing policy in many places where in order to get the voucher, they had to be single parent families, right? And so there's your answer. It's some things you have to think long on, some things you just hear and it's like, I didn't even know. I explained to you that part of the reason why crack was no pun intended, was cracked down on the way it was by the federal government was because it created a whole new class of millionaires in these communities. They couldn't track the money. They didn't like that. They didn't like the fact that it was making so much money. And then what people did with the money, they bought guns, they bought semi-automatics, they bought all types of weaponry. And that gave the police in the 80s and 90s an opportunity and law enforcement to say, we've got to arm ourselves against them. And so it was a tit for tat. You see how things get escalated. So now, as a result, now the military, you see the militarization of police. I explained to you about how the Patriot Act was signed for one thing in 2001 when everybody's eyes were on Osama bin Laden running around in a cave. We weren't thinking that this would be used by overzealous prosecutors to ensnare entire groups of people at wholesale and say, oh, they're involved in terrorist activity. Why? Because they're involved in a terrorist organization. Why? Because we said it is. Why? Because, well, we've got a couple robberies and they threw up a name or they threw up a sign and, well, it's a couple people all throwing up that same sign and they got the same color. So we're going to tie them to that organization, right? I explained to you how you're helping them in the process. It used to be they had to wiretap you. It used to be they had to drill through your wall. It used to be that they had to do all these weird things. What did the lady Kellyanne Conway got in trouble for saying that people were they were watching through your microwave? Now you're telling them. You got on social media, you're telling them your whereabouts, they're tracking you, you're talking to people on Twitter, on IG, saying all types of hot stuff, and you are, because I'm watching it. I watch it because I try to give advisement to some of these gentlemen and ladies, like, come on, let's be a little smarter. I was watching a gentleman the other day. He says, I'm about to, quote, drop the Addy right now for everybody to see. He's talking about someone else, for whether the marshals or the ops want to pull up. I'm using his language, not mine. And I'm thinking to myself, okay, I hear what you're saying, but understand that ensnares not just maybe that person, but it also puts you squarely within that beef. So now it's no way that you can go into a court setting and say, oh, I had no idea. Because people try that. People have these nicknames. They're known by the nicknames. They're posting on social media with the nicknames. And the first thing that law enforcement will do when they stare at them is say, oh, you go by like C Murder. And what can the person say? Those are my pictures. That's not my phone. And then they've connected all their friends. Sometimes conversations that they've had that are incriminating, all types of things on that phone. And because of the Patriot Act, I'm going back to the Patriot Act, prosecutors are much easier able to say, we need to look into the cloud, because that's how they did when they were trying to break down those terrorist cells, which makes sense. It makes sense for them. We gotta look in and see what's happening. So the same way, all they need is one phone. All they need is one person. Now they're in it. And now, I hear these apps now called Clubhouse. You need to be very careful what you're doing on there. You need to be very careful if you're in an open party line, because that's essentially what it is, talking about anything at all that could ensnare anyone in the legal system. Period. Somebody said, oh, I invite for you. I don't need it. I'm good. I don't need to be on Clubhouse. I don't want to be on Clubhouse. Not the way that it's set up now. And I can tell you firsthand knowledge, because that I'm involved. I have my feet in many worlds. I can tell you for a fact that it is being used as a tool for law enforcement to ensnare people, overzealous people who've decided that they want to use Clubhouse as a new opportunity to share what they feel about some rival, or they think that they're just talking and sharing. And law enforcement said, we love it. We now know TikTok was pretty much created at the behest of the Chinese government to spy on America. So you don't think that there are certain things that are being created, right? Right under your nose, you're using, and it's not for that. See, what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to show you how, remember how they pass a law and it started here? It's like the bait and switch, and then you turn, it's like, I didn't know it would be used for this. Oh, wow, I didn't know it was this. I told you they got Chris Brown when they hit Rihanna on a terrorist charge. Like, who even knew? But they used, and it was a novel conception, but they used those to say, making a terrorist threat. They said, legally, it's no different than if you would have called the airline and said, it's something on that plane. Now, you and I might think different. Common sense might say different. The folks that passed the law at the time in the chamber might have thought different, but I'm telling you the practical effect of how it is. And so I want you to understand this, because in every way, in everything, understand that there's what's happening and then there's what's really happening. There's the game and there's what's happening under the game. That's what I'm trying to help you to understand. I learned the game in law school. I learned what's under the game when I really got my feet and started working in these systems. When I was in these systems, started helping people, when I got out and helping people, pull people out, I said, oh, I get it now. And so I want to help you to understand, part of exposing truth is to know this is not that. Hold on, don't turn your focus. They want you to. Don't turn your focus. I know you're on the app and you think that the app is about the videos and all that, but understand it's a deeper reason. That's why, like I told you, I already told you with TikTok, the State Department, first of all, State Department told all the employees, you cannot even have this anywhere on any device that you own, period. Forget a device that has State Department stuff. And really, you shouldn't even be talking about TikTok, because they recognize what it was. So understand, because I want you to see all of these new tools that's coming out. You know, you got the Clubhouse, you got all this stuff. Recognize as you're using these tools and technologies, unfortunately, they are also being used as a reference point to continue the same policies, unfortunately, that has gotten us to this place. What's the solution? And I'm getting off. Well, it's a lot of things. First of all, you need to go to darrellbennett.com and comebackswinging.com. I want to know who you are. I want to know if you want to be connected to the work. There's a lot of work that we have to do. I can't give you a blanket answer for what you should do because I don't know your story. But I can tell you, you have a part to play in this. I can tell you that there is somebody that's going to listen to you that won't listen to me at all. They already turned me off. They don't want to hear me. They maybe because it's because of my story. Maybe it's because of the way I look. Maybe it's because of my accent. Maybe it's the shirt I'm wearing. But they'll listen to you because you have a story and you have power. That power comes from your passion. It comes from an awareness of your purpose. And that's why I'm so adamant about helping people get in touch with who they are. Because when that happens, we're going to begin to shift and change completely the way we see all of these things. You're not who they said you are. That's kind of the long way around this whole thing. I'm in many of those communities. I've been in many of those communities that folks are so quick to dismiss. They're so quick to have a story about. It amazes me. How can you have a story about something you know nothing about? You have an opinion about a world that you've only seen through a peephole. And if you're not careful, that narrative of your existence can drive decisions. When I came up with Come Back Swinging, actually, I didn't come up with it. It was divinely inspired, actually. I saw the words when I was laying in bed one day years ago. I still didn't know exactly what it would be, but earlier this year, actually last year, I felt in my spirit, literally, changing the narrative. That's why I put that as the slogan for Come Back Swinging. That the Lord would use me and my message, and it would connect me with other people and their message and their power to change the narrative. I'm tired of people talking about something they don't even know about. And if you're not careful, you'll listen to that. And the narrative, this is what I come to understand. The narrative that you tell yourself will shape your life. Unfortunately, we have a tendency to tell ourselves what other people do. I remember when I was a kid, I've never said this before. I told my mother, asked my mother, we can laugh about it now. I said, I cried. Am I ugly? I just felt ugly, between my eyesight and had bad eczema and just everything. And it's the only time I think I ever asked it. And the funny thing is, I think every person has that moment. You may not have asked, am I ugly physically? But you're asking yourself, even as you're listening, is it true all the things they said about us? I don't know if that us is a racial us or ethnic us, a gender us, and us because of your circumstance, because of your situation, and us because of your past, because of your family's past. Maybe it had nothing to do with you. Truth is, most of our lives happen before we even come on the scene. But I want you to know something. You're bigger than what they said. The same folks that were driving policy and housing and driving policy with all of the things that I was telling you about between redlining, the same folks that were trying to tell people what was best in their communities, the same folks that for Black History Month tell you who you should celebrate and tell you who you shouldn't celebrate. You always thought that was interesting. The same folks who, fought against the movement, but are yet so eager to tell you the leaders of said movement, because if progress really was a straight line like it should have been, we wouldn't have needed Dr. King. Forget he wouldn't have died. We wouldn't have needed him. We wouldn't have needed Marcus Garvey. We wouldn't have needed W.E.B. Du Bois. We wouldn't have needed Fannie Lou Hamer. We wouldn't have needed any of these folks. And so it amazes me, the rewriting, that's what my grandmama called it, the rewriting of history. How many people look back, right? And now they want to tell you about what the movement was and what the history is. And I want you to open your eyes and I want you to understand. Stop letting other people who don't have a clue, who don't know, who have no idea at all. And perhaps they have an idea, and that idea is to shape your decisions. That idea is to create within you a self-fulfilling prophecy that you're not good enough and that you're headed for doom. I've come to interrupt that pattern and speak directly into your life. If it's a narrative that says anything other than that you are empowered, if it's a narrative that says anything other than the fact that the more that they were afflicted, the more that they grew. If it's a narrative that says anything other than the fact that despite all of the adversity, we're still standing. Despite all of the times that they tried to wipe folks off the map, we're still thriving. If it is a narrative that teaches you anything other than to take pride in the history of the resilience of your people, the resilience of people who marked out a path, the resilience of people who would not take no for an answer, the resilience of people who gave birth to folks that even though had all types of things going on around them, have shaped culture as we know it around the world. I can tell you the first time I stepped foot in China, and I remember we were in Beijing, we were in Hong Kong. That's where we went first. We're in Hong Kong. 22-hour flight. I knew we weren't trying to go to sleep. We go to the club. Who's playing at the club? Who you think's playing at the club? And that's when I began to realize, when I started traveling globally, that there is a culture and there is a pride, there is a mystique that still people haven't quite been able to capture. And I want you to understand something. If it's a narrative that teaches you anything other than that, it's a lie. It's a lie. And part of what Come Back Swinging is about is we're going to change this narrative. We're shifting the narrative. Because what man meant for evil. Y'all know I wasn't going to get off here without throwing one reference in. Y'all knew that because that would just be unlike me. It just pours out what man meant for evil. What man meant. I know what man. That's what I want to tell you. I don't know if man did it or the enemy tried it. What I've come here to tell you is it shall not succeed. No weapon formed against you will prosper. It didn't mean that the weapon wouldn't be formed. It didn't mean that there wouldn't be policies that would be created. It didn't mean that there wouldn't be people who wouldn't sit in high positions of power and create ways to lock people out of systems. It didn't mean that there wouldn't be intentionality behind where we are now. But what it meant is, even though the weapon was formed, even though the policy was created, even though the legislation was promulgated, in spite of it all, it won't prosper. It won't succeed. Look at January 6th, kicking, screaming, fighting, looting, robbing, all of that stuff. Biden was still inaugurated. I want you to take heart in that. That was a picture supernaturally and spiritually of what's happening in your life. All types of things to try to put. And you want to know what's funny? It always gets harder when it's closest. You notice they did that right before the inauguration. I mean, if they really wanted to have great impact, if you ask me, they should have done it after the election when everybody was still kind of looking around like, oh, who really won? But that's just like the enemy. When your change is really about to come, that's when it gets hardest. When your breakthrough is right there, that's when it gets hardest. When your inauguration, when your season is right upon you, your moment. Do you notice that? Right when the album was going to drop. That's why it broke my heart with Pop Smoke. It broke my heart to the core. Right when this brother was right about to release this album. And I'm like, we gotta change, we gotta shift the narrative. Isn't it interesting that right before everything is about to take off in your life, that's when the enemy hits hardest. I made some of the poorest decisions in my life right in that period after I graduated from law school. That's when all these things were budding. I didn't realize it. That's when the enemy was hitting me the hardest. And I want you to understand something. The attack on your life is not because you're less than. I know that's what you've been told. I know you've been told you've been fighting an uphill battle your whole life because you're less than and your people are less than. You're never going to be nothing. I've come to tell you something different. You don't launch an attack against something that's not a threat. You don't. Ask any general. No general has a meeting for a strategy or a plan of attack against any nemesis. That's not a threat. I mean, if for those of you that's scrappers, you know if it's somebody that you know that's not fair, you don't even bother maybe to put on shoes that you might go out in socks and slippers. I'm gonna go handle this right quick. But when it's a threat, you gotta marshal your forces. And I'm not just talking a natural threat here. I want you to understand supernaturally and spiritually what's happening. There is a season that's shifting in this country. I remember it was said, there's nothing more powerful than a time. An idea whose time has come. The time came. This ain't about Kamala and Biden. This ain't about them. It's the time. This ain't even about Black Lives Matter. It's about the time of justice. It's about the time. Remember when Cain had killed Abel, remember? And he was, I don't know where he thought he was going to go. And God comes searching for him. And remember when Cain, most things people remember is that Cain says back, well, am I supposed to be my brother's keeper? This sort of like smart aleck remark. But this is what God says. God says his blood cried out to me from the ground. Don't think just because you got rid of him that he's gone. Don't think because he's dead that he's dead. Don't think that because the law was passed and that the story closed, that they had the military funeral, they had the great honors and that. Don't think that it's not a catalog in the mind of God, that this is still not being recorded. Don't think that this whole thing is being missed. There's blood that's cried out from the ground. There's blood that cried out from the ground. People always ask me, you always talk about the American flag, have the American flag. Do you know what these stripes represent? It represents blood. It's not conspiracy. They'll tell you that. It represents the blood that was shed for the freedom. That's what they tell you. That's what they tell you. That's the company line. We know it's blood. It's more than just the blood of the folks that they're telling us about. You have a part to play in this. And I don't want to, for 1 second, I know what you said, I'm gonna get off here, but I want to speak to somebody's spirit. I'm not even speaking to your mind anymore. I'm not speaking to yours. I'm speaking to your spirit. This may not even, words are time released. It may not even affect you now. But I'm telling you, there's a mission for you. I really believe that part of my mission in life is just to literally push this next generation. I'm telling you now, I'm helping shape someone that's going to be the president of the United States. I don't even know who that person is, but I'm just telling you. I'm telling you that what we're doing in this molding and mentorship, because this is what I recognize. This is what, because when I talk about the policy and all that, I recognize, oh, this was an attack against the leadership. See, if you incarcerate an entire, you separate the men, you incarcerate the men, or you have them running around doing all this crazy stuff. It's a leadership. So we got a bunch of men running around, boys running around trying to figure out on their own, trying to navigate the maze of masculinity. And they got more money perhaps than they know what to do with, but there's no mentorship. And so what's happened is it's gotten worse because, and not even my computer's telling me I got to go. It's gotten worse because there is mentorship missing. There's mentorship missing. And I recognize that, yes, there's value in me doing great things. There's value. Look, I think I'm not so concerned about being successful. I want to be significant. Success is when you make yourself, right? I want to be significant. I want to make somebody else successful. Every door I've opened, or it's been open for me, so I help somebody else come through. I wrote my first book at 18. I can probably tell you 18 other people who wrote books because I helped them. I can name for you right now 5 people that are at Harvard or one of these law schools because I helped them, right? So I'm just telling you, this is my goal here. It's not for me to just have a great organization, for me to be known, for me to, no. We are mentoring and creating and empowering a whole new generation. And I'm telling you, what's coming down the pike, it's going to look different. I chose this purposely. I know sometimes people are used to seeing me one way and the button up and all that. I did this purpose because I want you to see what's coming down the pike. It looks different. I even had to shift my own way of thinking. It was after I had certain experiences, I had to open my eyes. Everything, Daryl, isn't going to be tied in a tight bow. That's the problem. We want our deliverance to come the way we want it to come. But it's going to come from in many places where the problem came from. It's going to come from the same communities we dismissed. That's what I've come to realize. It's going to come from those places. Don't look no further. The answer to this is going to come from the same places that we shut down and the same places we walked away from. That's the essence of comeback swinging right there. Not that we get past our past. Not that we overcome our past. No. It's something better than overcoming your past. It is that there was purpose in the pain. It is that in my darkest moments, there was something that came out. Who would have thought we'd celebrate the cross? Come on now. You celebrate the day of a death because it's not the death. We understood what came after it. Y'all can get me talking about something totally else now. And so comeback swinging is about, I want to, even in your darkest moments, there's something there that's going to give somebody else a glimmer of hope. It's something there. It's something in that moment. It's something in that moment of embarrassment and hurt. It's that place. It's that place. It's that place. I'm going to leave, but before I leave, let me say this. Everybody talks about the burning bush. Everybody talks about God telling Moses, I want you to deliver the people. Everybody talks about that. Let me tell you the thing that I love about that story more than anything. He tells Moses, he says, when this whole thing is done, you're going to bring the people back to this mountain. That's what he tells them. He says, that's going to be the sign. Because I don't want you to just think you're going to deliver them to some abstract place. There's a destination for you. I'm speaking to somebody. There's an expected end for you. I don't care what people told you. There's a destination for you. And so he tells Moses, you're going to bring them back to this place. That mountain may not mean much to you. It may not. It's Mount Sinai. That's what the Hebrews called it. Mount Horeb, that's what the Egyptians called it. It's where Moses spent 40 years of his life. It's where the wilderness was. It would have been, in some cases, would have reminded him of everything that was wrong in his life. Remember, he had been raised a prince at the knee of Pharaoh. Some believe that he is the child or was raised as the child of Queen Hatshepsut herself. That's what some believe, that he would have been in the court of King Tutmosis. And through a series of poor judgments that he makes, he finds himself running from where he called home. He was never really home there. I wish I could talk about that because he was a Hebrew raised in the house of an Egyptian. It's really a whole lesson in that. because you can be raised in something that's really not what you're supposed to be. Something can be normal, but not be what it's supposed to be. But I don't even want to talk about that now because that's going to take me somewhere else. And so Moses, for 40 years, it's 40 years that he is in the house of Pharaoh. He leaves after he does this thing. He's running for his life. And for 40 years, he's living with the Midianites at this mountain. Destitute. He's a shepherd, but this is not a glamorous job. He was a prince before. Now he's a shepherd. I got to speed this story up. The point is, nothing from the 40 years as a prince would have seemed to make any sense for where he was in the 40 years as a wilderness on the side of that mountain. He forgot everything. He had kids. He got married. He had kids. So much would have passed. Certainly he would have heard news of what was happening in Egypt, but he would have had to block that out completely. His children knew nothing of his life in Egypt from what maybe he would have said. His whole life and everything that they knew, the Midianites and everything, was everything he knew from the wilderness. But yet he had a whole life from Egypt. And now God comes one day at the side of the mountain in the form of a bush and has a conversation with him. And Moses turns aside. The fact he turns aside is a whole message in itself. God didn't call out till he turns aside. There's some things in your life you're going to have to stop doing and focus on for God to get your attention. I'll tell you about that later. He turns and then God speaks. And God tells him a series of things, including, I've seen the cry of my people, and I'm sending you back. And Moses is hesitant. But this is the point I really wanted to make. He said, Pharaoh's going to hesitate. The people are going to be skeptical. But this is the thing. When you bring the people back, bring them to this mountain. God took the mountain that was their pain, and that was the mountain that he brought the people back. And when Moses, the failure, Moses, the murderer, Moses, the one who was on the run for his life, a fugitive on the 40 years on the backside of that mountain, returned as a deliverer for his people. And that was the spot, the same spot that God himself thundered the 10 Commandments, that the mountain melted. The scripture says that the mountain shook so thunderously that fire came from the ground and that even the beast couldn't touch it. And that some consider to this day, when you go to that mountain, we've seen it with our own eyes, there are these shards of glass, almost like it is from a heat explosion. A heat explosion. It could have only happened once, and we believe that heat explosion, and scientists have known it came from somewhere else. That heat explosion happened literally at the moment that God met Moses. And those shards of glass, or that glass-like substance that's there, is still there to this day as a memory for the mountain that was pain that God transformed into purpose. That's come back swinging. That's the story of my life. Ha! That's the story of your life. And that's the story of our lives. My name's Daryl Bennett. I got to go. I've been on here much longer than I was supposed to be. All right. Y'all have a great day.